Greetings and peace, everybody. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Today I have the honor and privilege to be joined by Brother Peter Moon. I have known Peter for a while now, listening to him first through Douglas Dietrich, and then after that I started following his work in terms of the Montauk Project, the Time Travel Education Center, and I've been fascinated with Peter Moon, his background with Scientology and other things in terms of his experiences and the kind of life that he's led. And today it's a big honor for me to have Peter on my show and to introduce my audience to what Peter, the kind of life that he's led, his teachings, his experiences, and to share that with the world, and most importantly, my channel. So I would like to give the stage to Peter so he could tell the world who Peter Moon is and how did he become to be who he is today.
Hi, and thanks for having me on. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm a writer and publisher, and it all began with a book, The Montauk Project Experiments in Time, published in 1992, written in 1991. And that was a collaboration with a scientist named Preston Nichols, who was an expert in electromagnetics and had a lot of strange phenomena he discovered that he was living, and his knowledge of electromagnetics was such that he was involved in a project which manipulated time. And that is what the Montauk Project story was about. It's a very spectacular story. And when I heard the story, I knew it would make a book, and I knew it would make a very readable book. It required my skills as a writer, though, to kind of uncomplicate Preston, who was a very complicated creature. He's passed away now, but so that made me a public figure, that book. And of course, as I began to investigate the time experiments he was involved in, I began to experience synchronicity and make connections above and beyond the story that he presented, which were very tangible, real connections, such as where they used to do the experiments was once the site of ancient pyramids, and that the custodians of the pyramid were the Montauk pharaohs, who were the royal tribe of Long Island, and some of them claimed descendancy from the pharaohs of Egypt. So that was a third book I wrote, Pyramids Montauk. And the story is a very rich story without what I brought to it, but I added even further richness and corroborations of the original story, all leading to my visitation by a time travel scientist, Dr. David Anderson, who befriended me and eventually led me to Romania. He brought me to Romania in 2008, where I have been involved in investigations not only of his work, but with another Romanian author whose stories are really over the top as far as a hidden chamber beneath the Romanian Sphinx with holographic technology. That's a whole nother story, but this is a brief introduction of who I am and what I've been doing. I've been in the business 30 years now.
Thank you, Peter. That's absolutely fascinating, and it basically gives an idea of the type of life that you led and in terms of the foundation that you created in terms of your teaching and what you're leaving behind for humanity with your books, with your teachings, and your messages. Now, how do you describe the concept of time travel and the different aspects of the Montauk experiment for those that do not know about it?
Well, all of the time travel in the Montauk Project was based upon manipulating electromagnetic fields. And this traced back to the Philadelphia experiment, creating a rotating field. Now, what they were doing in the Philadelphia experiment of 1943 was trying to make a ship appear invisible to radar. And it depends who you talk to, but according to the original story, that it had a secondary effect. The radar made it slip out of time. Now, I could, with a little bit of preparation and homework, I could give a whole dissertation on how electromagnetics, a rotating electromagnetic field, would be consistent with the geometry of time travel. But those stories, in those stories, the original Philadelphia experiment, which was around before either Preston Nichols or I came around, it was the subject of books and movies. But the key aspect of that, which resulted in the Montauk Project, was that when people were subjected to these electromagnetic fields, to say nothing of the time fields, we're just talking about, were subjected to electromagnetic frequency that put them out of this dimension, or even in this dimension, it scrambled their minds. Their minds became problematic. According to the Philadelphia experiment stories, sailors who were involved in the experiment caught on fire. They suffered spontaneous combustion. They suffered mentally and physically. The sailors were taken to Brookhaven, well, what became Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was not then. It was Camp Upton in Yaphank, Long Island. Mm. And they were diagnosed, scrutinized, tested, and a whole project was taken underway to find out why when men were subjected to intense electromagnetic fields, particularly those that went out of this dimension, why did they discombobulate? Why did they mentally suffer? So this Brookhaven Labs grew up around this experiment. Brookhaven Labs, of course, was the premier atomic research facility in the nation, and it was run by what were called associated universities. It has since, in recent decades, been put under the Department of Energy in the US government. It was a quasi-government agency, being that it was run by an associated universities. But there was a lot of richness around these stories because Brookhaven National Labs was right in Yaphank, which is right where they had the biggest contingents of Nazis before World War II. And there was the biggest contingent of German National Socialists outside of Germany. And right there, next to Brookhaven Labs. So the Brookhaven National Laboratory became the place where they initially studied the minds of men. And they correlated this with the research from the captured German documents and the work of Dr. Joseph Mengele, who experimented on twins and midgets and did all sorts of inhumane experiments. But while his experiments were inhumane, they were meticulous for their accuracy and what they measured. So they were considered valuable to researchers. Eventually, they were able to integrate the mind of man with computers and with radar. And as this evolved, it became a form of mental manipulation, both from the participant and against the participant. And this project was canceled by Congress because they realized they could be mind controlled, but then it went underground. And when it went underground, it left Brookhaven and went out to Montauk Point, the eastern end of Long Island, the South Fork. It's the easternmost point of New York. And Montauk had an old Army Air Force station, Camp Hero. And then by 1972, it was part of the Air Force. And it had this huge radar dish about 2/3 of the size of a football field. It was huge. And there were 12 of these around the United States. And they were to detect early warning of enemy aircraft. Of course, it became antiquated with over-the-horizon radar, was no longer needed. However, the frequency that the radar ran at, 435 megahertz, was the approximate, what was called frequency of the mind of man. In other words, 435 megahertz was considered to be the window frequency to the human consciousness. And when you have a window to the human consciousness, you can broadcast out what the human being is conscious of. And this was experiments done on the local population. There were all sorts of strange stories of animals behaving improperly. We even caught some of that on video in many later years. They were still monkeying with radar out there, and the animals will behave. But this is no great secret to anybody who's been around radar. It will change your mood. It will change your feelings, and it can be used against people. What was special about the Montauk Project is that they were training psychics, one in particular individual, Duncan Cameron, to amplify what he was thinking, and he could not only change what people were feeling or thinking, he could actually change matter, energy, space. And this is where the time became a factor, is that objects could be influenced, changed in time, manifested out of time. And this became a series of experiments that are very, I guess, what you'd call anecdotal. But the story's pretty fragmentary, but also pretty deep. And it resulted in a lot of problems, because although they were successful at time control, they were not able to manage the chaos that came. And the project was shut down, and it ended up in ruins. And when it was in ruins, the Air Force abandoned, or the secret crew, we should call them, abandoned the Air Force station. And that's where Preston Nichols walked in and was sort of reintroduced to his old job, and kind of came on and started piecing things together. And as much as he did piece things together, there was still a lot left to be desired. That's the Montauk Project in a nutshell.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And that exactly makes sense about how a lot of these different experiments throughout the U.S. government's history and throughout this nation's history have taken place. And it's not to the public's knowledge, because these type of things we don't get taught in the school history books. So you are owed a debt and a gratitude by the seekers and those that are seeking knowledge, those that are trying to find the answers to what is reality, what is really going on. So I thank you for that, for laying the foundation for what the Montauk Project was and what was the reasoning and explanation behind it. Now, Peter, I would like to ask you about your experiences in Romania with the Solomonari, and also with your background in terms of Scientology, and how your life's journey kind of led you from one point to another, and how it basically was a reflection of different events, of
Well,
synchronicities and events.
first, I would clarify that the book, The Montauk Project, has been taught in universities, has been studied in universities, and as well as high schools. How many, which ones, I don't remember, but it's because it's been out there, almost 30 years. So it's
Probably a few, because I know here in the Pennsylvania region where I'm at, like especially in the Philadelphia suburban area, I never heard of it until after I got out of school, and I kind of looked it up and found it on my own. So that maybe, I guess it
you're,
depends on the area.
you're a new generation. In the 90s, this was being studied because it was so outrageous, and people in Long Island, teachers got interested. They buy a whole, 30 books for their class or whatever, because it was interesting. And I had plenty of teachers. I had a science fiction class in high school, We studied science fiction. We studied topical things. I remember reading Carlos Castaneda's book for one of my classes. That wasn't, not everybody was reading it, but you know, schools are often wide open to what is out there. And what is out there, of course, is life. But
Yes.
I would start by saying, to answer your question, I would never have been able to put this book together or to have fathomed the strange world of Preston Nichols if it were not for my experiences with L. Ron Hubbard and what he accomplished with Dianetics and Scientology. And I had gotten involved with that when I had graduated high school a semester early and became involved because it offered not only a hope and a promise of a better world, it delivered actual results at that time. What fascinated me about it, it was something that was telling you could explore the unknown aspects of your human mind. And I said, wow, I would like to see what else is inside of me other than what I know is inside of me, the obvious stuff. And it did allow that. Any counseling procedure has the potential to do that. Most counseling procedures are relegated in normal psychological aspects to people's addictions and problems that are right in their face, where they have to go to counseling out of desperation. The counseling in Dianetics and Scientology, what would often happen with the person is they'd be going to do this, that, or the other thing, and they'd find out, they'd discover that their life was in shambles. They didn't realize it. They were just going on through, you know? And they would be given a series of processes that were tailored to the individual called life repair. And one needed to have their life repaired. Most people do, even if they think they're doing great. And that was something. So it would go at that. And you would also address the basic psychological rudiments of human beings. And at the time I got involved, I was not so much receiving those procedures. I was more into dealing with psychosomatic ills, which was Dianetics, different than Scientology. And those procedures, I would routinely see people, you know, being announced that they completed this level of that, and they were just gushing with laughter and joy. It was infectious. It was profound. It was nothing like I have ever seen ever since. Just the only thing I could compare it to in my own experience is when my Qigong teacher, Roosevelt Gainey, asked me to come to a seminar. And I said, well, I really don't have the funds for it. And he says, it's okay. No, he says, you just tell him you're my guest. You don't have to pay anything. He says, I want you there. And what I don't remember what he said, but when I got there, there was a handful of his other students there, and he wanted props. He wanted props because he was teaching to a bunch of people who were very well schooled. And I don't remember if it was Tai Chi or Qigong or both, but they were all dead in the head. They knew all sorts of theory, but they couldn't do anything. And I saw why he wanted us there. He wanted some live spirits in them. So he wasn't talking to a bunch of, I don't know if you've ever had occasion to talk at a library. It's like talking to a bunch of stiffs.
Yeah.
Old people. It's like talking to stiffs. And but his one of his longtime students, I would have called her the most passionate student at the time. We were telling our successes to the other students, what we'd accomplished. And when she got up, she went into tears. I never saw her go into tears before. I knew her for a long time. And because when she started Qigong, she was like super obese. I even saw pictures of her. Now she was thin and, the kind of woman you'd want to take out on a date. And she was old too. She was not a spring chicken. You wouldn't know she was so old. She was in tears because he had saved her life. She was like end-stage diabetes. And she had bones that couldn't creak. I mean, they were creaking, they couldn't bend. And he saved her life. And she was crying. That was dramatic. That was the only thing. But that wasn't, that was more of a physical process he was doing on her. He would have told me he never did fix her mind. He would have told, he basically didn't say it in those words. He never fixed her mind, but he fixed her body. But those tremendous successes I saw, and this was in 1971, it was just incredible. Now, I had my own experiences with Dianetics where what happened with me is they talked about this state called exteriorization. It meant leaving the body. Now that was something I wasn't even aware of or particularly interested in until I got involved in Scientology. And when my first session in Dianetics, I experienced this. It was an incredible feeling. I didn't really realize what it was. And then it kind of messed up the rest of my counseling because I was kind of discombobulated on some level. So they administered to me something called the interiorization, exteriorization rundown. Because the problem, when you would go out of your body with most people, you would go back into it. But it's kind of like a car crash. You might leave your body because you've been forced out of it, and then you come back and your body's all messed up. Well, that's not the case with everything. But I remember addressing psychosomatic feelings, pains that were in my experience and relieving myself of those through mental imagery, one of which was an airplane crash, a airplane crash from another dimension, whatever you want to call it, but you're visualizing, the throttle going down your throat. That's not exactly what happened. I'm being a little facetious, but you and you die. Every death is an exteriorization. And when you had a painful death, if you don't erase the pain, if you don't face the pain, whether it's real or imaginary, there's a lot of trauma. Now, this trauma that's associated with going in and out of the body is no different than what the Hindus or the Buddhists talk about, is this endless cycle of death and rebirth. And that is traumatic, according to Buddhists and Hindus. You want to get off this wheel. You want to get off the wheel. So is incredible and as fantastic as Dianetics and Scientology as I have made it sound. And I will tell you that it was. And it was because one of two reasons. One is because it offered a dream and a hope, which is wonderful, which excites the hell out of people. And two, to the degree it delivered, it compounds the excitement and gives you reason to go more. So there were, but for whatever this subject and was part of my fate, part of my destiny. I never would have thought it because I had no particular desire. The Scientology was run by a select group that L. Ron Hubbard had created in 1967 called the Sea Organization, the Sea Org for short. I met somebody from the Sea Org a few weeks after I got interested in Scientology. He came to there to talk about it. He was recruiting, and I felt my destiny was there. My destiny was there. I felt this resonance with it. And it was unusual, and people were rather struck because I was so new. I was very new to the subject, and they did not understand my enthusiasm for it. Whereas most of the staff were deathly afraid of it because it required a huge commitment. It was a life commitment. They called it a billion-year contract, but it was my destiny. So what happened was I was 18 years old. I was not allowed to go. My parents didn't want me to go, so it was a moot point. I got involved with Dianetics and Scientology and did very well with it. I learned to be a counselor, and I moved fast, and I moved quickly, and I was very serious and very dedicated. My dedication, after about a year, they changed the laws in California so that 18-year-olds were now full-fledged adults. They could do everything but drink alcohol. So I could now join on my own recognizance. And I was 19, and circumstances happened, and I did. And when I did, and I said goodbye to the people I knew and told them what I was doing, most of them had a fear. You could see the fear in their eyes, like I was going to Mordor in The Lord of the Rings or something, because it required such a commitment. And of course, there were stories of people going there and not making it. One of my friends, he completely bombed out there. And you could kind of tell that he didn't have what it took, whatever it was. It wasn't a bad guy. It wasn't an incompetent guy. He just didn't have whatever. And I had, and after joining the Sea Organization, within a month and a few days, I was, after thinking I had performed horribly, in some ways I was sent to the ship with L. Ron Hubbard. It was called the Apollo. I was sent there. I didn't even know where I was going. I was carrying a bunch of stuff for him. I was accompanied by a lady who had been there before. We both were carrying stuff for Hubbard and our own stuff, and we were sent to Spain, to Madrid. And in Madrid, we were told where we would be going. And we were going to Casablanca. It was kept very secret in Morocco, and that's where I joined the ship. And I think the very first time I got it, I was taking a tour of the ship, and I got to see Hubbard. I didn't talk to him, but I got to see him working in his office, and it forged a association. I would eventually work in his personal office. So I was very, I guess what you'd say, by circumstance and by necessity, driven to be close to him and to understand him in ways that not only most Scientologists, certainly the general public, but most Scientologists and most Sea Org members did not have the opportunity to understand him. The ones that would be the exceptions who understood him more in some ways, and in some ways they didn't, would have been his messengers, those who worked with him directly, like in answering his every beck and call. I never did that. And one of their, so they had to deal with his, whatever his personal issues were. I knew much about his personal issues, but I was shielded from any of the most of the problems they had. And one of the great deficiencies of those young people, they were all very young, was that they were sort of grew up in Scientology and they didn't have the opportunity to learn the features or take advantage of them for the most part. So their understanding has a degree of limitation, to where you had more educated Scientologists. He wasn't surrounded by educated Scientologists in his day-to-day life. He was in his administrative capacities, but it was so everybody who experienced L. Ron Hubbard and or Scientology had unique understandings of him. It was personalized to them. The ones that sometimes it was very distant and they hyperbolized it in their own mind. For example, even before I got involved in the Sea organization or directly with Hubbard, one of the people I knew at the place where I got involved, it was called a Mission of Davis in Northern California. He came up to me and he said, he talked to somebody who told him that L. Ron Hubbard was, had an aura around him, a glowing aura, and he was just blown out. And I looked at him and I didn't say anything, but I thought, this guy is delusional. He's just talking shit, L. Ron Hubbard had an aura. All human beings have an aura, but this was somebody, blowing up a balloon. And, I rejected it. It was hearsay. It was hearsay. And I rejected it because it just sounded stupid. Yeah, he was an amazing person. People would exaggerate him. And he was the first thing I learned when I got to the ship, he was a human being. He needed 8 hours of sleep and he had a lung condition. Now, you see people saying, oh, it doesn't work. Dianetics, Scientology doesn't work. He was a lung, it's like, I learned it right away. And I was taught even before I got there that he was a special case. He was an experiment. He smoked. I didn't smoke. Many of the Scientologists did, but it's like, people judge things, and yeah, there's always negative things to find or point out. The question is, what was of value and what could you do with it? I was able to capitalize. And the most important thing I would say with regards to the Montauk Project and Scientology was that L. Ron Hubbard somehow in the 1950 was writing about the effect of electronics on spiritual beings. He was writing about how people were implanted with electronics, and the whole game of beings that believed in that people were nothing more than meat bodies was that part of their game throughout millennia was to implant spiritual beings with electronics. Now, he doesn't say where he learned that. He doesn't say where he came up with that. It was obvious that he learned some of that from the Navy and his early association with British intelligence and radar. But it had more to do with therapy. And if you were to go in and visualize yourself being bombarded with radar, from psychologically bombarded with it, it kind of clears out the mind from being affected by that. Doesn't make you completely foolproof, but it makes you highly resistant. So when I met Preston Nichols almost 20 years later, I had a reference point and understanding of what he was talking about, because he was talking about using electronics to mind control and implant people. So he was right out of an L. Ron Hubbard diatribe. And he was not in any way or shape or form connected to Scientology. He was the victim and the engineer of implants, because he knew electromagnetics, he knew how to shock people, he knew how to condition them with electroshock so they could be programmed. He'd give whole lectures on it. I wish I would have recorded them. And he was a victim of it as well. So I had a reference frame, and if it were not for that, I was on familiar territory, and it was like I was uniquely qualified to help him with the book. Not only to help him with the book, but to understand the whole process without being intimidated or vulnerable. Because most of the people who got close to him resonated with being victims of the Montauk Project, which I never did. So that's the prehistory of the Montauk Project. The post history is begins in 1999, when a man came into one of our monthly meetings that we used to have on Long Island. The date was August 11th, 1999. There was a Grand Cross, and this is a big significant event in astrology. And it was also coincident with what were called the biorhythms of the Montauk Project. A biorhythm is a naturally occurring rhythm. You have biorhythms in the body. Your heartbeat is one. There are many other biorhythms, cycles that go through the body, go through the meridians or the energy channels of the body in traditional Chinese medicine. But the earth is also considered to have a biorhythm. And the Mayans recognized it. Dowsing cultures recognized it. But according to Preston's research of the Philadelphia experiment, which occurred on August 12, 1943, the biggest biorhythm of the Earth was a 20-year biorhythm. And it occurred in 1943, which they did the Philadelphia experiment on, August 12th. And the biorhythm occurs anywhere between the 10th and the 14th of August. In 1963, they did a project in Brentwood, Long Island called, well, they called it colloquially the ITT Brentwood Project. It's an obscure project that Preston could never find out too much about, but it was indeed the forerunner of what we know as the HARP Project. The 1983 August was the climax of the Montauk Project. So when it came to 2003, well, that's another story, what happened, but this was 1999, and there's a yearly biorhythm. The 20 years are the strongest. The yearly biorhythms are significant. The 10-year biorhythms are not as strong as the 20, but they're stronger than just the 1 year. So it was 1999 Grand Cross, and people, astrologers and dowsers, were all waiting for this big date because there was this big shadow. And some of it was focusing on my work. The shadow, either what they call it, the starting point or the ending point, was right at a place in Cornwall, England called Menantol. It was like a donut-shaped stone with a phallic symbol not far from it. And this featured in my second book, Montauk Revisited, where Aleister Crowley was said to have put his son through that donut hole, and a line of rough water ran from there to Montauk Point. So a lot of stuff was focused on me by those who were familiar with my work. Now, I didn't really know any of this at the time, but on that very date, Dr. David Anderson walked into my life. He walked into the meeting, and he told me that he had a time travel laboratory on Long Island, and that he was able to change time, speed it down or slow it down in a field, self-contained field about the size of a soccer ball. His company was funded by people primarily in the medical field who saw great value in this technology because it could slow down the decay of an organ. And this is one of the main problems in organ transplants. They have a short shelf life. They have to be moved into another body fast. They can't be preserved for very long. So this technology was very valuable. And that funded it. Now, David was very mysterious. He wanted to work with me, he said. He took me out to lunch about a week after that. And then we came back to my house, and we must have sat in the driveway for a half an hour talking about this new foundation he wanted to put together. And he had just gotten back from Romania. He says, "You've got to go to Romania. I want you to meet this woman. She's like an expert in esoteric, sciences and metaphysics. I want you to meet her. But what I'm putting together is a foundation, a nonprofit foundation for primarily for Romanian artists, writers, and scientists, and for kids, kids the ages of 16 to 30. And this was his dream. So we were talking a lot about tax strategies and whatnot. And then he came back later and he put up my first website. But he was always kind of mysterious. And without going into the long and short of it, he had to disappear in after 9/11. He was sent to Moscow because he had been a member of the Air Force, which is where he developed the theory for the technology. The Air Force didn't want to do it, so he left. And then when he was trying to get out, the Air Force got real interested. They tried to stop him from leaving, but by then it was too late. He had his own industry. But when you're been in the Air Force, they can call you back anytime, any service, they can call you back. And they called him back after 9/11 because the United States was then invading Afghanistan. And after the invasion, he was asked to go to Moscow. He could never tell me where he was. We did get an email from him that was from Pakistan. But to this day, he still won't talk about that because it's classified. In any case, when he came back, he was forced to go out of the time travel business. He closed his center in Long Island. He maintained the one in New Mexico, which was probably the flagship one. He had another one in Romania, which was for theoretical work. And he liked Romania because they have the best mathematicians in the world, he said. But it was still a long way before I would get to Romania. He had met with me Easter, the night before Easter Sunday in 2003. And he was going to hand over all of his materials from the Time Travel Research Center, which was basically, he was trying to set up a museum on time travel. It's a lot of artwork and a lot of books. And he wanted me to have them. Preston and I went up, and he could only we went all the way up to Rochester, where he lived at the time. We drove about 8 hours. We met with him, invited him out to dinner, but he said he had to go. He was too busy. He talked with us for about 15 or 20 minutes and says, "I won't be able to see you for 5 years." I'd occasionally get a postcard. One was from China, but he did exact to his word. He contacted me 5 years later and said, "How would I like to go to Romania? All expenses paid for you and somebody you want to take with you." Now, prior to that, that year, the previous year, 2007, I got involved with Qigong, courtesy of the medicine man of the Montauk Pharaohs. It was the medicine man of the Montauk Pharaohs who introduced me to my Qigong teacher, who I studied with for 10 years. And just like I took Scientology very seriously, I took Qigong very seriously. And I take it very seriously to this day. And what I have learned and what I teach is not like anything you're going to see on the internet. I watch these guys. Some of them are doing incredible things with knocking people without barely touching them.
Yeah.
I was subjected to seeing this stuff routinely from my teacher. He didn't like to show it to new people because he says, I can attract 1,000 students, but what am I going to have? You know, people are, and all these people showing this, those students are not going to learn that. They're not going to learn it from those teachers. Many, and I can't speak for the individual teachers, but many teachers will never show it to them. They're showing off, in essence. There are some fake ones, but there are plenty of them who can really do it. And the problem with and then the other thing is you'll see them doing these fancy forms that are very aesthetic. These are okay, but they're not teaching the most fundamental aspects of Qigong. And I'm reluctant to say what they are, but I will tell you. And I'm reluctant to say it because it's like, it's almost like people don't deserve to hear it when they act like that. It's common sense. It's breath. It's breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Now you'll hear every Tai Chi teacher, very important to breathe, very important to breathe. In fact, one time, one of my friends was teaching Tai Chi. She gives a whole lecture on Tai Chi. And at the end of it, I said, well, you didn't say anything about breath. Well, that's in the next lecture. No. Breath is in the first lecture. It's the preamble to everything. It's breath, and more breath. And I've been trying to put together, as they say, unfortunately, when my computer went down, when I was doing Douglas's book, I had the classes all ready to go, but they were lost, much to my disappointment. I have to redo them. But fortunately, I've got all the verbiage. I just need to put the actual videos together, which is a challenge. But anyway, it's designed to put one in it, not just learn something, but to actually experience, increasing their breath, increasing their capacity to breathe, and doing it in a logical framework, which I would say might get across better than my teacher could get across. Because my teacher he was just amazingly accomplished. And it's a challenge to communicate to the student. And he had many challenges communicating to his students. And because they didn't listen to him. And he liked me because I listened to him and I did what he said. And did I do everything he said? Of course not. But I did enough to where he knew I was listening and paying attention to him. And therefore, he would share critiques with me of other students, tell me who he liked and tell me who he didn't like. And this was kind of unique because it gave me a foundational understanding. I don't have certainly all of the accomplishment that he did, but it's just a matter of teaching people how to breathe and be healthy. This is the first step, making them stronger. And but anyway, he was introduced to me through the Montauk medicine man, and this is a big key point with Montauk because so many people have read the Montauk Project and associated themselves with victims of as victims or experimentees or people who revolt. They resonate with it. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you feel. However, one has to step past that, get past the mind control, and get into the sacred element, which is not only the pyramids and the pharaohs, but I mean, the medicine man was half Chinese. His mother was from Hong Kong. His father was Native American. So it's like natives are embracive of all cultures.
Yes.
Not like some factions where you're this or you're that. But in any case, the training I had done in Qigong enabled me to take this book from Romania, which had been on my desk for 4 years, and actually read it. And then I decided to publish it. And I negotiated with the publisher in Romania who actually built his whole very successful publishing company based on the Montauk Project. That was his first book. It was read by a member of Department Zero, Romania's most secretive intelligence unit. And he saw the Montauk Project, he read it in Romanian, and he asked the publisher if he'd like to publish his book in Romanian, which he did. They put it into English and gave it to me. It took me 4 years. Not until I studied Qigong did I read it. And then when I read it, I negotiated. And as soon as I finished the negotiation, within a week's time, David Anderson called me or wrote to me and said, I'd like you to go to Romania. And that was in 2008. And I went to Romania, and it changed my life forever. I went back the following year and listened to him lecture on time. He had been out of the time travel business. He told me at the end of 2008 he'd be going back into the time travel business. The following year, he delivered extensive lectures on the subject, even personally tutored me on a concept which is called the invariance of the space-time interval. As soon as he was out of my presence, I forgot it. When I got home, I had to relearn it. I did an article on it. It took me, I kept going back to Romania. I was told by this woman he wanted me to meet, and by other professors, member of secret society, says, another member of secret society, he said, you must go to the sacred, to understand Romania, you must go to the heart of Transylvania, the sacred capital, the religious capital of Transylvania, not a Christian capital, but it was called Sarmasejatuza. And it took me at least 20 minutes when going home to my apartment in Romania to memorize it. 20 minutes of memorizing that word, Sarmasejatuza. And that was an ancient structure of stones with wooden posts. The posts were reconstructed for a movie. I think it was in the 1980s during communist times. But so the place is a very magical place. And I was told I must go there for 3 days. And I had my first adventure there in 2009. I was escorted by a beautiful young Romanian lady who's my close friend to this day. When she saw me, she just came up and hugged me and said she had a strong feeling about me. Well, her feeling was pretty good because, she volunteered to take me the next year, and she would become my lifelong friend. And she took me to this, it was a remarkable journey, but it was only the beginning, because the following year in 2010, I went back and tried to do a film with the students. Then I went to Bulgaria for 10 days. This is a whole nother story we won't go into. In 2011, my friend I just mentioned, Nicole, she wrote to me and she says, are you going to Romania this year? I said, no, I don't think so. I don't really have the funding. And she gives me a sad face. And because she's a very devout Orthodox Christian, I said to her, why don't you say some of these Christian prayers and maybe a miracle will happen. She did the prayer. With 24 hours, a woman called me, Martha Thomas of Chicago, and she says, I want you to go to Romania with me. I'll pay your way to Romania. I want you to lead me on a tour. I want to take other people, but I want you to go. I want you to take me. And I said, well, I'll go. But once we get there, we got to have a guide because we're going to be, dead in the water without a Romanian guide. We got to bring this girl, Nicole. She'll already be in the area. I just need you to pay for her accommodation and whatnot. And she says, oh, that's fine. She says, you pay for the food and I'll pay for the accommodation and all the transport. So I said, oh, that's fair, And so Nicole's prayers worked. And we went to the Sphinx. Now, I didn't mention it before, but beneath the Sphinx, there's a Sphinx in Romania. And this is where the book that I was talking about is a secret chamber that they discovered. And it's a whole story of the book Transylvania Sunrise. And that book is about this chamber that was discovered by the Pentagon and America because they saw that there was an area that they couldn't penetrate with the ground penetrating radar. They couldn't figure out what was down there. And it gets involved with Freemasonry, connections to the Pentagon, and they approach Department Zero and want to get at it. And it's about all the politics to get at it. But when they finally do get at it, the Freemasons are left out of it. But the Romanian Department Zero and the Americans arrive at these holographic records. They have tables that read out DNA of different civilizations and combinations of different DNA of animals, hybridization of animals, infinite supply of genetic information, or virtually infinite. And there is a projection hall in there that features holographic renditions of the history of mankind. And you can go in and look at the history of mankind. But every person who looks at it has a tailor-made history to their own mental persuasion and DNA. Within that projection hall are 3 tunnels. They each go to different areas. One goes to a similar facility beneath the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Another one goes to a similar station in Tibet via another similar station in Iraq, beneath the ground of Iraq. And there are more aspects to that tunnel. These become the subject of other books that have been published since. And perhaps the most spectacular tunnel is the one that goes inside the earth, the civilizations inside the earth. And these books, when I first did it, I didn't know these tunnels were going to result in whole new books. It took over a decade for these things to manifest, all of them. Like the first book he wrote was, I think, 2003 or 4. It's now, the most recent book was in 2020. So this has been going on for 16, 17 years. And I have participated in the editing of these books. I can now edit them in the Romanian language. But I don't speak Romanian, but I can translate it and edit it with the help of Google Translator. I've learned how to do that. And then now what happened in 2012, I was brought back by another tour leader, a channel named Jeanette Crowley. And I went with her. I was the esoteric guide, about 40 people, in addition to her and her husband. And that was very, very profound. In 2013, now that was the big 10-year biorhythm not as big as the 20-year, but something very significant happened there. I arrived on August 10th in Romania, and I said, I was telling man who was supposed to be a tour leader about this book I was working on. It was called The White Bat, because I had had a dream in 1989, far before I got involved in Montauk, of going to Dracula's fortress, Polonari Fortress. I didn't know the name of it then, but it just looked just like it in the dream. And I got into his sacred lair, saw his wives, and he found me there amongst his brides. They were vampires. I was on thin ice anyway. And he began to just felt that he'd been violated, and he chased me. He chased me out of the castle. But as he chased me, that wasn't a castle, it was a fortress. As he chased me out of the fortress, the sunrise happened. And I realized he was now vulnerable in the sunlight. I turned and chased him. To escape me, he turned into a wolf, and I grabbed at his heels, or the ankles of the hind legs of the wolf. I grabbed him, but then he turned into a bat. And when he turned into a bat turned around, became white. And then a white version of Dracula appeared. He was the antithesis of Dracula. This is the whole secret of yin yang. And I wrote a whole book called The White Bat, The Alchemy of Writing. My dreams were bringing me to Romania many years. That was the first thing. They brought me via Montauk. And this was, so when I mention this, and I'm telling them, he gets very excited, and he points to this little girl who was his girlfriend. I didn't know it at the time. And he didn't point to her. He referenced her. She wasn't, I don't know if she was, he says, oh, there was this little girl who saw this white bat just the other day. She saw this white bat in Mashande's cave. Mashande was a blue goddess who appears in the book Transylvania Moonrise. I said, I didn't know Mashande had a cave. So, but there was a white bat. So then we set out to Sarmisegetusa, the great capital of ancient Transylvania, the heart of Transylvania. It was not the first time I'd been there. It was the third time I'd been there. And I said, and when I got there, well, that night was preceded with a lot of fanfare. All sorts of people showed up at the hotel we were staying at. It was like my Bulgarian friends were there, my Romanian friends were there. It was like homecoming. It was outrageous. I mean, I'm being greeted in this foreign country of Transylvania, foreign part of Romania, Transylvania. It was like old home week, because it was like probably my fifth trip to Romania, maybe my sixth. And I just heard about the white bat, and it's just fantastic. All this energy that is happening in the place. At the same time, there was this new age musician who showed up, and he was giving a concert simultaneous to this. So whatever energy was going on, it doubled. And the next morning, I told the story of the white bat. I was told, and then they said, yeah, well, we just seen a white bat. This was the biorhythm. So then we go to Sarmisegetusa, and I start to see even more people. I see this guy that from the camp I go to, he's there. This is like, 10 hours away by car from the camp. And my friend Bogdan, I said, what are you doing here? He's there. My friend Nicole is there. I didn't know Nicole was going to be there. I mean, she doesn't live near there. It was 4 years to the exact date we'd been there before. So it was, and then I got to meet the little girl who saw the white bat. And she talked to me about it. And I was pumping her for information. And then I walked, after I met this girl, Lavinia, I walked over. I was by myself, totally. I don't know why I was by myself. Maybe I was walking to get some of their sacred water, which you can go fill up your water. And then I ran into this attractive young woman, and I looked at her and I said hi to her. She knew who I was. And I said, "You're the girl from the video, aren't you?" She says, "What video?" Well, I had been sent a video of a bunch of girls in a wisdom school. And this one stood out to me, unusually stood out. And I explained to her, and she was indeed the girl from the video. She didn't know what the hell I was talking about. Oh, this woman would become my wife in a couple of years. But it was like I met her at this sacred site. And it's, if, as they say, this is like if you were a very devout Roman charismatic Catholic, and you went to visit the Vatican and you got in the Pope's chamber and you happened to meet somebody who became your wife. It was that kind of a meeting. It was very beautiful. I didn't know she was going to be my wife. I didn't know that. We talked later in the afternoon, and we both felt that we had a very strong connection, and we acknowledged that.
Mm-hmm.
And but that was, so Romania has had a very profound experience on me. Now I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to backtrack to part of what led to that in a metaphysical sense, if not a actual sense. After my first trip to Romania, David Anderson had greeted us on the phone when we got there. I was with my friend, Tantra Bensko. And the reason she came with me is she was the only one that actually showed any interest. I wanted a videographer to do it. And she had some experience, but, first person I asked was my daughter. She didn't want to go. I asked one of my best friends. He was a videographer. He didn't want to go. So Tantra, she was a great traveling companion and a great friend as well. And she was a Tantra teacher. That's what one of her activities. She's also a prolific writer. But we were like, that whole trip was a clash between being treated like VIPs and then being treated like something less than a VIP. It was drastic. It went from the flight cancellation, and then when we got there, we were VIP'd through the airport, through customs, through immigration, with some pretty girl escorting us everywhere. And then pretty soon we're left with, to get our baggage. And we get the baggage, and we're greeted by, somebody from the camp. And then we're put on the phone with David. I'm put on the phone with David. And he says, "Greetings," and, blah, 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 blah. We've got this driver. He's going to take you to, to your hotel. So the driver has to drive about, 2.5 hours to our hotel with us. We're in a van, and the hotel's closed. They sold out our rooms. They sold out our rooms because we were delayed, and nobody called ahead. So we got to pause. We had to drive another, couple hours to get up to this mountain resort. It was the only place we could go. We must have arrived around 4 a.m, and we were lost in Romania. We didn't have any communication. Finally, and it just got really confused. So we ended up at a place called in Sinaia called Palace Castle. It's a beautiful castle. And I was there by myself for a period of time, and this beggar approached me. And he was a very unusual man. And he wanted money. And the taxi driver had given money that had been given to him, pay for our lodgings and food and whatnot. And it was Romanian currency, and I didn't feel proper about giving any of that to him because I was like the custodian of the money. When I got back, Tantra sent me an article about the Solomonari, and it said that she had some, I guess what you say, acumen for what you call the mendicant. One of her publications she did a long time ago was called The Mendicant, the beggar. And although I don't find her to be a beggar personally, she had some appreciation for that mindset. The Buddha would use an alms bowl, and that was a tradition of many monks in the East. But anyway, she said that these indigenous spirits of Romania are the Solomonari, and they live in caves. And they are the ones who initiated the patron god of Romania, Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis was a man who was transformed into a god. And he was in a cave for 4 years with the Solomonari, and they transformed him to where he became immortal. And he later went on to teach the theories and religions that became Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and the Egyptian religion. Very ancient god. And this is their tradition. So when the Solomonari would come out, they would appear as sheep, shepherds, or beggars. And when they appear as a beggar, they're testing your heart. And if you give them something and you pass the test of the heart, they will open to you the heart of Romania. This is a very well-known legend in Romania. They will open the heart of Romania to you. Now, I did not pass the test. I didn't pass the test because, logical reason not to. I didn't have any money for him. If I gave him American currency, I don't know, would have confused him. And I also am resistant to beggars from having lived in New York for a long time, where, they've actually had begging schools where people aren't broke at all. They just beg. So it was from a very different culture. But when I learned of this, when I went back, and it wasn't until I was with Jeanette in 2012 that I went out and I found a beggar. I went out of my way at Palace Castle again. It just happened to be at Palace Castle. I mean, I didn't know we were going back there. And I gave him some money, and he blessed me 7 ways to heaven and back. It was beautiful. I didn't ask him to bless me. I just gave him the money. And that night, I had remarkable dreams. And I think it was August 12th. And then eventually things began to open up for me on that journey. But it was the following year that I met Paula, which talk about giving the heart of Romania. You're had no desire to get married again. No desire I never went to Romania looking for girlfriends, although the customs officer on the way back, he says, "You're looking for a wife." I said, "What are you talking about?" What are you talking about? No, because apparently, people do go there looking for wives from America, but I didn't know what he was. And then I explained to him who I was and what I was doing. He says, "Oh, I understand." He didn't have to say that. I mean, it wasn't going to stop me getting back in the country, but he just made a comment. But no, I didn't even have that mindset. And of course, I met her, and everything changed. Mm-hmm. And so Romania delivered for me in a way that I never would have expected it. So the legend became true. And when I went back there, and when I go back, I will I will generally be approached. One time on the trip, last time it was by a gypsy, old gypsy lady. It was at a roadside stop where you get gasoline. And when you get gasoline in Romania, you see these places, these Exxon stations or whatever, Sunoco stations we have on the East Coast, and they have all this 7-Eleven type junk in there. In Romania, they have a lot of healthy food in there. They've got some junk. They got their share of junk, but you can go into those places and get some healthy food when you stop at a gas station. It's not such a awful experience. And then, but some old gypsy was out there, and I gave her some money, and it's almost like on cue. I didn't see a beggar again on the whole journey. I had the previous trip. I walked out of a restaurant in Bucharest. We had a whole van of people, including my daughter, and this woman approaches me. I think she has flowers, and she's approaching me. She's a gypsy, and I said, I don't need any flowers, thanks. She says, no, not for the flowers, for me. And I said, oh, good, got it. So I give her some money, and my daughter was with me. She makes some comments on me, and she says, I said, you don't understand. I said, no. She says she's approaching you because you have a fanny pack on and you look like a tourist. I said, no, that's not why she's approaching me. This is meant to be. Yes. And then two of my Romanian friends started challenging me, saying, what, are you going to see every beggar you're going to give money to? I said, no, you don't understand. I said, you won't see another beggar coming at me on this whole trip. You're not going to see it. And sure enough, there wasn't. And I explained, I'm not stupid, but this is a right brain activity, meaning creative side, intuitive side. The brain, you have a right brain and a left brain. This goes back to ancient Egypt. It's also in modern psychology and modern psychiatry. Your left brain is your linear analytical brain. The right brain is your nonlinear, your creative intuitive brain. This is an intuitive process I engage in. I'm the one who's getting the gold, so to speak. I don't mean that gold in a physical sense. I'm getting a result. And boy, did I get a result. I honor this principle because, first off, it's a tradition that I've learned to be very good at. So I might spot the beggar out of a crowd. And so what happened on that particular trip, after that happened, we went back to Palace Castle, believe it or not. Again, it wasn't on my agenda, but we end up back. And this is not exact, it's kind of out of the way. So we end up there, and a whole brouhaha drama begins to break out amongst the group. And I'm not even going to go into the details of it. And as soon as it got better, it exacerbated the next morning. Anyway, sort of like best friends no longer liked each other after that trip. It had nothing to do with me, except that I was a witness to it, and it dampened some of my expectations. But when we got to where we were going, which is the story I haven't talked about, Choclavina Cave, we took a digression at my direction, and we discovered this camp, which is now a second home to me. So we discovered the camp. Everybody liked the camp. Everybody liked the guy who ran the camp. But the next year, none of the people went back except for me. I got to go into the cave. And this is where the Solomonari bring you into the cave. I got to go. The heart of Romania has opened. Well, we're going into the deeper chambers of the heart. And should I discuss the cave now?
Yes, definitely. And, before you discuss the cave, Peter, I'm just fascinated. Your life, it reminds me of what the Sufi masters teach us about mastering the breath and the aspect of what you learned in your Qigong teachings and also how everything in your life was meant to be. Everything was written. They call this the aspect of maktub in Arabic, that everything in your life is written for you. When your life went from Preston Nichols, Dr. David Anderson, then your experience with Scientology, with Qigong, going to Romania, have everything just kind of fell in place for you, being tested by the beggars, which I also experienced in Sufism as well, where I would experience dealing with a lot of these great mystical masters, and they would be on the street and they would test you to see, like, is this person really who he says he is? And they would test you, and then after that, they would bless you with their prayers and protection and just the goodness and light that they carry around you. And it's very fascinating that you also experienced the same in terms of your experiences with the Solomonari in Romania, then meeting your wife, and all of the great things, including the your experiences in the cave. It was basically one moment leading you to another, and it's a fascinating story about this human life, Peter. That how when we can't even comprehend or imagine what's coming a year ahead or the next year, your circumstances in life could totally change within a year's time, and that's why I always enjoy and learning from you. It's always a pleasure to get this aspect and get this knowledge that we look at the present situation of our life and we get upset thinking that maybe things are not going our way, but eventually our present situation is not our final destination. And just listening to you and your background just strengthens one's faith to just keep the faith and to just keep doing what you're doing. So please carry on. Thank
Well,
you.
yes, you find yourself in positions where you have to sort of, the balls will be set up on the pool table, but you've got to execute the shot.
Yeah.
It's set up for you. Anybody who's ever played billiards or pool, you've got to, some layouts of the table are favorable and relatively easy. Some are impossibly difficult, but the table gets laid out. You have to take advantage of it. You have to seize the moment. But I was discussing this cave. We're going to track this back to 2000. 2014. In 2013, I met Paula. In 2014, I went back in May in hopes of visiting Mashandi's cave and where the white bat was supposed to appear. But it's too muddy and rainy in May. I still had a fantastic, what I would call pre-honeymoon with Paula, and where we discovered that we were very unusually compatible, even though to this day, I'm twice as old as she is. And it was even more of a disparity then, because I think she was only, what is she, 33 now? She was, 27. And I was probably 62, but a young 62, but still nevertheless 62. And she was with me. I went back in August and I was with her and a group of friends. And I had met in May this archaeologist that the owner of the hotel had wanted me to meet for a long time. And then he came back in August at his own direction and wanted me to see this cave. He took us all to see the cave. We had a wonderful afternoon at the cave called Chaklavina Cave. It's got a huge mouth. He told us some stories about Titans that were mostly mythological. He said that many of the stories that I had told from Radu Cinemar's books, which he had not read, lined up with many of the interviews of people he's had in the area. He was studying the area with drones. I suggested he go into the cave with drones. He thought that was a good idea. I don't know if he's ever done it. But like the people are like Solomonari. They bring you to the cave. He brought me to the cave. Now, it was a nice afternoon at the cave. But it wouldn't have been so special, except the following December, Paula came to New York. We got married in January. And it was, I had written to David Anderson and told him that I'd married this Romanian woman. And he called me on my birthday. He didn't know it was my birthday, to congratulate me on the marriage. We talked for and talked to him a long, long time. And I put him on the phone with Paula, and she was just flabbergasted at how well he could speak Romanian. And anyway, I began studying his website, and it was all based upon the lectures he'd given 6 years earlier. And I began to use a technique from Qigong of going and submerging myself in complete darkness. And I was able to understand things and put them together in writing. And I sent them to David. He had one or two minor corrections. They were minor. Clarification that this was not wormhole technology, with the clarification. But in any case, you don't need wormholes to time travel. But the thing is he was so impressed with the article. He says, can I use this if I go to speak at universities or elsewhere? I said, well, of course, it's your work. So I copyrighted it in both of our names. He says, nobody's had the patience to break this down before. You did very well. And it basically explains that time travel does not violate the laws of mathematics or physics. So, and I would invite anybody who wants to pursue this to go to the timetraveleducationcenter.com, where there's 7 free videos that explain this in 8th grade mathematics. It takes a smart adult sometimes several runs through to get it. Some people don't get it. Some people do. But it's all there. This was the foundational steps of his work. Now, so anyway, he said he had responded. He says, I see that you'd asked me to do a podcast, because I was doing podcasts then. He says, yeah, I'd love to do a podcast with you. Surprise, surprise. So we arranged to do a podcast. In preparation for the podcast, we had long discussion about what we were going to talk about in the podcast. Then when we went to do the podcast, his earphones didn't work. So that delayed the podcast, and we had another discussion, just talking. That led to multiple discussions with him, and I've never had so many discussions with this man that were meaningful. When you talk to him often, he can digress and keep you off the topic that you'd like to talk about, because it's very sensitive.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's hard to get information, but he was as open as I've ever seen him. And I said, well, what can you tell me about Romania? I want to know about Romania. And he says, I'll get back to you on that. So we get back, and he says, well, I can tell you about, this was when we were supposed to have the actual broadcast. And he says, this is what I found out about Romania, or this is what I can tell you about Romania. There's a cave in Romania called Shoklavina. He mispronounced it, even though his Romanian's good. He called it Shoklavina. And he said, this cave is very important. It's the most important spot for where we have evidence of a huge discharge of space-time motive force. That means that a time reactor has been there. There is an element, and it's called, or a mineral called hydroxystalactite, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it requires a high degree of heat, which he says could only have occurred by the presence of space-time motive force. He said, this is evidence that there was a time reactor discharge here. We can tell by the sediment it was 200 to 2,000 years ago. Now, okay, I said, well, David, it's very interesting because I was at that cave last summer. Oh, you were? That flabbergasted him. I was at the cave, the most important part. Years later, he would reiterate what he said, only expounded upon it. He said, Choclavina Cave is not only, there are other places on the planet that have evidence of time reactor discharge, but he says Choclavina is by far the most significant, and not all the information on it has yet been released. So when I found this is 2015, I couldn't go back in 2015 because my wife was too dependent upon me. She didn't have any, she didn't even have a green card yet. She was okay to be here. She was applying for a green card. She didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't go to Romania and leave her here. How was she going to shop, you know? So I wouldn't leave her here. I wouldn't go to Romania that year. But the following year, she had a driver's license. She was self-sufficient. I think I went back with some friends. She was also in Romania, but we didn't go together. We met up, I think, the night after I went there. But I went with my Romanian friends and American friend, and I went back to Choclavina for the second time. Now, Choclavina Cave is known for its bat guano. It's a huge repository of bat guano. And the bat guano, there was a road built there, a crude road to get there by the dictator Ceausescu, because the bat guano was used for explosives. At this day, it's used for fertilizer, primarily for cannabis, and you can't go there anymore. It's the part where they get the bat guano is closed off. The open cave, a big cave, which has got water running through it, and you can't go in there very easily. Anybody can go in that if they have the equipment, but it's not just to go exploring in. The other cave, which is the dry cave, is where the abundance of bat guano is. But the road there was built by the dictator. So I went back there, and this was 2016, and boy, I had wanted to spend the night near the cave. And my mother-in-law, my Romanian mother-in-law told me, she says, if you go, you will be tested severely by nature. And because my Romanian friend who offered to use his tent, I didn't want to subject him to that. I said, I subject myself, but I'm not going to subject one of my friends to being severely tested by nature. So he took his family, and then I was in a car with a Romanian friend of mine who was our driver, and my friend, American friend, and what was his girlfriend. He met her through me, a lovely Romanian lady who was a very good friend of mine. So it was the two Romanians and two Americans with a Romanian family, and we went to this, and this road was hell. We had to get out of the car, move rocks. Sometimes we had to push the cars through the water to get to the cave, to get to the lot near the cave where we parked. And then we discovered the dry cave. We didn't know where it was. We discovered a second cave with a metal door at the end of it. You go down about 50 yards through this man-made cave and you find this metal door, but it's locked. And that was a discovery. Then we went out in the meadow and had a picnic. My Romanian friend with the family left, and then my friends, they went exploring. But me and my female friend, we were left behind, and the weather started getting bad. And we started making it back to the car. I had insisted everybody get ponchos. Everybody had their poncho but me. I didn't bring my poncho because the weather was nice. I had it in the car, but I didn't have access to the car. So by the time we made it back to the car, it was raining hard. I went underneath this huge tree. It became so hard that finally it didn't matter how huge the tree was. The rain was penetrating every branch and I was getting soaked. I had a camera, a video camera that I gave to my friend, and she put it under her poncho. And we sat there in the rain, and I'm thinking like, oh my God. We thought that our two friends were lost. They did have some paranormal experience, and my friend's brother was looking at him on cell phone connection, and said that he was now in Kosovo. Something weird had happened with them, but we didn't think they were going to come back. And I was visualizing spending the night in the cave just to be out of the rain with my friend. And then we were going to walk back to the town, which was probably a couple miles away. And I would have been no good in English because nobody there would have spoken English. She would have been able to get us help somehow. But all of a sudden they came back. But I had my severe test of nature. And I was tested. It was like an initiation. I was getting totally soaked, uh, even though I was under a tree, a big, fat, thick tree with a thick branch. Um, but everybody was fine. And we went back to the hotel where we all got warm and dry. But that was my second trip to Choclavina. The next year when I went back to the camp that I go to at Atlantic Run, I got everybody interested in it. And one of my friends there had taken an adventure into the camp. He showed me videos of it. Found huge bones. He said belonged to a human being, a giant human being, a mixed bare bones. He went about 3 kilometers deep into the cave. Says you have to wear a breathing mask. He wouldn't tell me how he got in. He's high levels in secret societies. Either got him through there or you can get permission to go in. It's the dry cave. So I had done a whole presentation. He showed his video. The third time I went back was with many of my American friends where they had the squabbles. That's where I discovered the camp. Now I had a place I could stay and go to. When I got back from that camp, when I got back from that trip, I got an email from a Romanian friend who's a director, and he says, you were just at this camp. I'm talking to my friend here, and he says an American was just here. I said, that had to be Peter Moon. He says, yeah, I couldn't remember his name. He says, yeah, I said, that was me. And he showed me a picture of himself in the cave with all this, wetsuit and stuff. And I didn't realize that I would be in a similar wetsuit the next year because I went back the following year, and this time I was alone. None of my friends who had been with me and had their squabbles came back. I came alone. I was with my Romanian friend, the one who brought his family. This time he took and another young lady who volunteered herself, who I knew her mother, and she insisted on going, so she came with us. And we had a great time, but we went to the camp, and as soon as I get to the camp, I was invited into the cave. It's like it can take you years to get invited into a cave, and by tradition, by the Solomonari. And they don't always bring you into the cave physically. Sometimes they will bring you mentally. But I got to go to the cave. I went in about, I think he said we were in 2 kilometers, which is a mile. We were deep into the cave, and I'm very sure that we were very close to where David had said the event had occurred, because the article explained what they called the bivouac room. Bivouac means camping, and we had sat and rested in this huge room. And there's not a lot of it's not a room, it's an area. There's not a lot of areas in there. So that must have been the room they were talking about. And the element is in a little alcove off of that cave. But I was too exhausted. I won't go into that whole thing, the exhaustion factor, but I was in there for 5 hours. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And was directed after leaving the cave, by the cave. I was talking to somebody and I realized I needed to put a ham radio in that area. So I've collected the money for the ham radio, transmitter, and antenna. I just need to execute it. I'll be working on that probably more next week. It's been delayed by COVID. I have, and this was a message I got from the cave to facilitate communication to and from the camp. But that is, and of course, this is David's hottest spot of research that I happen to have stumbled upon. There's more to it, and there's more I hope to investigate when I go back there. It won't be this summer because there are too many COVID restrictions I don't want to put up with, and I will probably go back the following year. And that's my story of the cave. There is much more involved, but that's it in a nutshell. That's the Solomonari initiation there, even though they don't appear with a certificate saying I am a Solomonari or a sign. You're working with an energy, a spirit.
Thank you, Peter, so much. And I hope my audience was able to learn and be able to understand these different points of knowledge and perspectives that Brother Peter Moon has graced us with his presence. And I encourage everyone, from the books that he has mentioned, his works, please go to skybooksusa.com and check out all of his selections and his works. And I myself have patronized Brother Peter Moon and support him because that type of knowledge and that type of gift that's out there, it needs to be supported. And I have one of the books right here, which is the Roswell Deception new publication. And besides that, for final comments, I would like to ask Peter, what message would he like to give to humanity for the next 10 years with the events taking place, and then we'll conclude it from there. Thank you, Peter.
Well, I will preface that with saying that book you just held up, The Roswell Deception, that could be a whole nother broadcast in itself, but it's how one thing leads to another. I wrote a novel called Spandau Mystery because it was to get at answers I couldn't get. In other words, by doing normal research. It had to do with the murder of Rudolf Hess. It had to do with the Moorish nation, the Moorish nationals, the Moorish indigenous people. And it had to do with certain occult factors. It had to do with Montauk. But where the book ends, and it ends with the two characters who are the hero and the heroine of the book, who overcome the evil guys. And I don't really, if ever there was to be a sequel, which I did intend at the time, it was the two characters were going to go for a vacation out to San Francisco, the opposite end of the coast from Montauk, where they were going to become in the preceding scandals. And this is the very stuff I'm working on with Douglas Dietrich and this Roswell Deception. Douglas Dietrich is the primary author. I'm the one who compiled it and put it together. But this is how life works. One thing leads to another. Instead of writing that novel, I'm now writing that reality of what happened at the Presidio. And one of the things that happened at the Presidio was Douglas Dietrich being ordered to collate all the materials on the Roswell incident. And that's what you'll read about in this book, The Roswell Deception. So we won't go into that. But as far as message for humanity, I have mentioned these biorhythms of 2040 or 1943, 1963, 83, 2003 is when they discovered this Sphinx, what was underneath the Sphinx in Romania. The next one coming up is 2023. And I believe that something very monumental will happen. in 2023. If the Montauk Project was more spectacular than the Philadelphia experiment, and the discovery beneath the Romanian Sphinx was more spectacular than the Montauk Project, I would expect what is discovered in 2023 will be in August 10th to 14th, and I intend on being at Chocolabina Cave during that biorhythm. And I think there's going to be something very exciting. This is from my perspective. I can't speak for the whole globe because we each have our own perspective, and I don't want to stretch myself too thin by talking about political situations that I'm not personally involved with and don't have necessarily a bird's eye view into. So I try to keep to what I'm doing, because I can do a better job by focusing on that. So that's the exciting time, 2000. And I did an article on it last year. It's a year old. I'm going to review the article. There's a lot of positive astrological signature on that date. It's kite. It's called a kite. And I analyzed it in a previous newsletter. I want to go back and reread it myself because it's a portent of good things. And when you say change, I expect there to be profound change.
Yeah.
In my own life, the circumstances will change. And right now, I've just been focusing on getting Douglas's book out, this new book, The Roswell Deception. I encourage everybody to, you can get if people who listen to this podcast right away can go to skybooksusa.com. They can get it at a discounted price, probably for the rest of this month. So that's my message. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Peter, so much. And again, I encourage everyone, go to skybooksusa.com and support Peter's work, and also Brother Douglas's book as well. And I thank Brother Peter Moon for gracing us with his presence and knowledge. Thank you, Peter, and good night.
Thank you, Simon.